In the last segment, I spoke about how impressed I was by the fact that the first three Alien films all managed to conclude Ripley's story in a satisfying enough way that doesn't undermine or step on the toes of the prior films. Well, that streak had to end eventually. Alien Resurrection is the strangest entry to the series, but if there's one thing that you have to admit, whether you like it or not, it's that it's definitely unique. After the tepid to stone cold response to Alien 3, Fox learned their lesson. Their incessant meddling meant that Alien 3 would be the weakest release in terms of the critical acclaim and revenue that it would receive. Alien made almost 10 times its budget, with Aliens making almost 8 times, and Alien 3 managing just 3 times its budget. Now, that is still a profit, of course, but it's a huge drop off, so it had to be addressed. To right their wrong, Fox hired Jean-Pierre Jeunet, fresh from his work on The City of Lost Children, and gave him free rein to create his vision. Jeunet to this day is thankful to the studio for granting him his first overseas break, and has openly praised the studio for their hands-off approach. In fact, Alien Resurrection is so heavily stylized that it could only have come from a mind as colourful as the Frenchman's, who would go on to bring the world movies such as Amélie. Everything is truly dialed to 11 here, that is except for the story. Alien Resurrection is a textbook example of style over substance. A popcorn flick that can be enjoyed for sure, if you can let your brain turn off for a while. And for me, this is the moment where the Alien franchise truly forgets what it is and why it was so beloved. Set 200 years after the events of Furina 161, Ripley's DNA has been used to clone her in order to retrieve the Queen Xenomorph from her body. As you'll recall, we last saw the Lieutenant as she heroically sacrificed herself to keep the alien out of Weyland-Yutani clutches. But enough time has passed now that the Yutani Corporation no longer exists, and in their place is the military organisation on the USM Auriga, who clone Ripley in order to study and control the xenomorphs with hopes of bolstering their bioweapon technology. After multiple bites at the cherry, they're finally successful at reviving Ripley, though she's not completely herself. She shares fragments of the original's memories and experiences, but this Ripley's genetic makeup is a hybrid of a human and a xenomorph, which grants her super strength, reflexes, and acid blood, among other things. The military scientists withdraw the Queen from her body and lock the Queen up for breeding. They also educate the infant-minded clone, whose behaviour is anything but human at this point. To help carry out their research, the military then hire a group of space pirates on the Betty ship to kidnap some innocents to be impregnated by the Queen's spawn, and, as I'm sure you can guess, this goes swimmingly. The aliens escape their containment, and to stop them from reaching Earth, yes, that again is the crux of this plot, the mercenaries must team up with the untrustworthy Ripley, whose allegiance to humankind is put to the test in a game of will she won't she that's so conflicted and inconsistent that it's clear that not even the filmmakers could really make up their mind of what side she would be on. This feels very much like the awkward teen phase of the series. On one hand, its expression of graphic violence is so gratuitous that it would snuggle in nicely rubbing shoulders with the Saw franchise. On the other, the film is chocked full of cheese, from Clone Ripley landing a no-look over-the-shoulder basket, to Ron Perlman being Ron Perlman. It's a pretty wild ride, and is miles off of the established tone of the series, and not in a subtle way that makes sense like we saw in the tonal difference between the first two movies. Alien Resurrection is like a theme park ride awkwardly plonked in the middle of a stunning national park. You come to appreciate the beautiful scenery and take in the atmosphere, but you end up walking away with a sore head and a bag full of your own vomit. Sigourney Weaver returns for her final performance as Ripley, albeit as a clone rather than the genuine article. Ripley is mentally vacant at the beginning. Her sentences are simple and uttered infrequently, and her brain is childlike. Despite this, she is a physically intimidating presence, and proves to be quite the handful for the guards and scientists. There's a hint of the born sexy yesterday trope that was common in this decade of cinema within her character. Weaver has a lot of fun with this script, you can tell. The script, I wasn't surprised to learn, was written by Joss Whedon. and his specific brand of cheese gives her plenty of opportunity to show off her newly found playful side and her superpowers. Though she has this superhuman body, she has retained some of her humanity, which we get to see in her connection with Call, as well as when Ripley discovers the failed clones that came before her, that are kept in their own lab. This is a very effective emotional moment, in my opinion, and it never fails to leave me a bit shook as it's so uncomfortable to watch. It's perhaps one of the only moments where Weaver is able to switch on her prolific talent, which helped her to be nominated for that Academy Award over 10 years ago. Ripley must win the trust of the Betty crew, who doubt where her loyalty lies given her divided genetic makeup. Weaver protects the crew and works in their best interest, helping them to escape, but at the same time she seems to sympathise with the xenomorphs and care for them, which makes her allegiance unclear until the final act, where she all of a sudden switches to her old assertive and cocky self without warning. I don't think this is a very well developed arc. I do wonder if there was some missing components here which found themselves left on the cutting room floor, which perhaps could have made this so that she returns to the Ripley that we all know and love. It could have made it more fleshed out and natural. DiStefano is a grunt soldier on the Auriga base who buddies up with the Betty crew to help them escape, as he recognises that his best chance of escape is to ally himself with these rogues. Hillard is the Betty pilot. She's not a very fleshed out character. She seems to be strong-willed and tough, holding her nerve together even when her captain and presumed romantic partner is killed by the aliens. Hillard suffers from being viewed as someone who's there to make up the numbers, which is a shame because I think she was a cool character and I would have liked some more time with her. Speaking of the Betty captain, Elgin is the Han Solo of the crew, who abandoned his military life to pursue a career as a smuggler. He is an extremely cold individual and arranges and agrees to the mission with the military that sees the Betty deliver a shipment of innocent hosts to be impregnated by the xenomorphs in testing. Christie is the coolest character here. He's probably my favourite. He's the muscle, the Terminator member of the group, with his weapons sheathed under his sleeves at all times in case of eventual conflict. He's the one who rallies the group to work together when disharmony begins to set in. He's a very loyal crew member until the end, and sacrifices himself so that his good friend Vries might live. Vries is the paralysed mechanic of the group, who requires a wheelchair for movement. But despite this disability, he's very quick-witted and is very much capable in a crisis, surviving until the end, and playing a vital part in the successful escape. Joner is another example of the crew's muscle, though he's got more bark than bite, and operates with a more selfish mindset. He's the comic relief of the group, and Ron Perlman gives a pretty decent audition for the role of Hellboy that he would assume a few years later. Call is another mechanic, like Vries, and is the newest member of the crew, like Ash. Just like Ash, she turns out to be an android in an interesting turn of events. Call is the closest thing to a protagonist that we get in the film, and Winona Ryder does a decent job in the role, carefully walking the line between irritatingly bratty and somewhat sympathetic very well. Ironically, she's probably the most human character in the movie. Dr. Wren is one of the leading scientists responsible for cloning Ripley. He is held hostage by the Betty pirates as they look to escape the ship, and works with them to survive the rampant xenomorph attacks. When the crew are at their most vulnerable, he flees and betrays them, locking them in an elevator shaft with the alien. He attempts to steal the Betty and escape as the lone survivor, but the crew catch up to him. At a pivotal point in the story, Wren receives his comeuppance via one of his test subjects, Purvis, who kills him by giving birth to a chestburster whilst holding on to his torturer. Finally, Gediman is another of the leading scientists in the cloning project. He observes the xenomorphs very closely and becomes deeply fascinated with them. When they escape their containment and drag him down to what will become the Queen's lair, Gediman is cocooned for breeding, and only marvels at the chaos he has brought upon the ship. Okay, so it's fair to say it's a very large cast, but somewhat controversially perhaps, I would say that Resurrection rations its time with each of these characters far more generously than Aliens managed. The cast looks like they're having a blast, which helps Alien Resurrection to be the fun popcorn flick that it is. but I look for something a bit more from my Alien movies, I think. I'm not a huge fan of this film, and I do treat it as its own separate entity, set apart from the main canon story. This movie was released at a time when there was a copious amount of comic book material involving the xenomorphs being released.
Are you serious?
And Alien Resurrection feels like it took great inspiration from this. I should say that I haven't read any of these specific comics myself, but the stylishly presented, bombastic on-screen events absolutely reek of that comic book style to me, and there's very little subtlety present in the visuals, as Jean-Pierre Jeunet really brought his own visual style to the movie. I think his unique style also supports the tone of the film being a dark comedy piece. It all looks kind of wacky and slightly off from reality. This tone was something that hadn't been attempted in the series up to this point, and perhaps the fact that the series had to go on an extended hibernation of 15 years lets you know whether or not the experiment was a successful one. The film is extremely 90s. It's not even a negative thing, it's just an observation. Released in 1997, the film was crafted at a time of transition, as the world was still trying to get the hang of CGI and how they could implement it into their movies. The results were often a mixed bag, and Resurrection is no exception to this rule. There were many special effects moments created in this film by Blue Sky Studios that I think look really great, and even hold up pretty well today. But if I'm being honest, there are also some that look pretty terrible too, so it's important to recognise both and remain as balanced as possible in critique. Firstly, I would say that there are times where the xenomorph looks better than it ever has. By better, I mean absolutely grotesque and, above all else, alien. The underwater work in particular is fantastic. I think it's a really cool thing to see. It's very creative to see these creatures underwater, and it's quite a tense scene as a whole. But then it comes out of the water in that same sequence, and this leaves a bit to be desired. The light tracing looks a bit off, it's impressively detailed, but clearly stands out like a sore thumb, and doesn't blend particularly well with its environment, which is to be expected given the young age of the technology at this point. The shots of the Eureka station were done with the use of miniatures yet again. While Jean-Pierre Jeunet was happy to rely on special effects for much of the xenomorph scenes, he didn't think that the technology at the time was good enough to create scenes in an outer space setting. The score by John Frizzell is a highlight for me. We hear the return of themes from the series such as the hypersleep theme. It's a warm and homely inclusion which is definitely appreciated, given that everything else in the film feels so separated from the rest of the series. The new themes are enjoyable. In the main title music, Frizzell pays homage to Goldsmith's work, but then goes on to weave heavy orchestral sounds with a more alien electronic sound, to perhaps illustrate to us the struggle within Ripley with regards to her identity as a human xenomorph hybrid. It's a really intelligent bit of composition, I think, which complements the on-screen events perfectly. There are subtle hints of Horner's work in there too, as Frizzell clearly understood the importance of remembering and respecting that which came before his own work. He made sure to hold on to some of the strongest aspects of those previous scores. This is perhaps my favourite score of the anthology, and if not, is only second to Goldsmith's original. Sound is such an important contributor to the overall experience, and that can't be overstated enough, and this soundtrack lifts some of the more lacking aspects in my mind. It's interesting to me that this is perhaps the only aspect of this film that is consistent with the tonal scope of the franchise thus far, while everything else heads off into its own wacky direction. So, as I said earlier, this movie shoots to be a dark comedy. Now, does it succeed in achieving this goal? Yes, I would say so. Is it for the reasons that the filmmakers intended? Well, partly, but some of its comedic value also comes from its weakest aspects, and that brings me to the events of Resurrection's finale. As the Betty crew are nearing their escape vessel, Ripley finds herself in the alien queen's nest in the heart of the ship. This is the same queen that was surgically removed from her body, and just as Ripley possesses some xenomorph DNA in her body as a consequence, the queen likewise possesses some human DNA. This means that, for the first time, the queen possesses a womb, bringing the xenomorphs closer to our reproductive system. I really want to say how fantastic the queen's lair is as a set here. It's clear in moments like these that the budget of almost $100 million did sometimes go to good use, because this is one of those sets that looks positively disgusting. It's one of the rare occasions where I felt like I was immersed fully in the experience. I was repulsed by the wet and sticky surfaces. It was just vile, and the Queen herself is an absolutely brilliantly nightmarish piece of practical work. The womb she possesses isn't just for show, as she gives birth to the newborn, an alien that possesses physical human features, such as a face that sports eye sockets, human teeth, and even human genitalia. Her body sports that, not the face, of course. That would be quite something. This thing makes or breaks the movie for a lot of people, and it's easy to see why. It's extremely goofy looking, and its movements betray the fact that it's clearly puppeteered, which removes some of its fear factor and in turn our immersion. Its interactions with Ripley are strangely sensual, which is awkward at best and comical at worst. As a final callback to the first two movies, the newborn escapes onto the Betty ship before the base explodes, and the standoff between the alien and Call lacks that same fear factor that we felt in the original cramped showdown on the Nostromo with Ripley. Whether this is due to the fact that the creature just isn't as frightening as the menacing xenomorph, well, I'm not sure. After all, this is a subjective take, so maybe some do feel that the eerily human appearance of the alien is quite unsettling. But for me it just looks too goofy and unlifelike to really be taken seriously. Ripley cleverly uses her acidic blood to melt a hole in the ship's hull and defeats yet another alien by sending it out into space. If there's one thing that I have to say that is really effective about this scene, it's the sound design. The music is appropriately chaotic and tense, and it brings with it a sense of finality as the creature hauntingly screams in pain as it's sucked out of the ship as if through a meat grinder. Then Junot takes it a little too far and ruins the moment as the thing's skull is the last thing to go, and it looks like something ripped out of Scooby-Doo. The finale ultimately feels a bit rushed, and there was a plan initially to have the final alien confrontation and battle take place when the crew reached Earth. Joss Whedon actually wrote this finale, but his work was scrapped, and in its place, there was a deleted scene where Ripley and Call have a final heart-to-heart, as they discuss sticking around and starting a new life on Earth. On the planet's surface, we see that Paris has become a wasteland, presumably because humanity has ventured out into the stars and has left some of its major cities in ruin as a result. I wish we had seen more of this future version of Earth, and I believe that the finale might have been more impactful and certainly more memorable had Whedon's original ending been taken forward. But instead we get just another alien hijack ending, derivative of those that came before. And by this point you would hope for something a bit more original, especially given the fact that everything else in the movie did so well to veer off into its own fresh territory. Ultimately, I'm not a huge fan of Alien Resurrection. I think its cartoonish tone isn't really what I look for in the Alien franchise, and while I do have love for much of the visual experience of the film as well as what I consider to be one of the best scores that the franchise has to offer, I think that the corny Whedon-like script, the corny Whedon script is somewhat farcical. If this were to have been released as a standalone project with no ties to the Alien franchise, then I think that it would have been better received for what it is. But the company Resurrection keeps makes it a disappointing addition to this anthology as a whole. The return of Sir Ridley Scott to the director's chair was greeted with much jubilation from the fans of the series, and rightly so. Scott by that point had a massive filmography behind him of great quality. I know that I personally am a huge fan of his, so when Prometheus was announced, a younger me was absolutely ecstatic and was confident that the franchise was truly back in the safest pair of hands possible. But nothing about Prometheus would turn out to be safe. Instead, Scott ambitiously tries to push the boundaries that he himself set all those years ago to the furthest degree possible, boldly opting to have this adventure take place a half-century before the events on the Nostromo, as he would attempt to explore the origins of the iconic creature introduced by himself, H.R. Giger and Dan O'Bannon. Ridley Scott returned with the intention to release multiple films which would explain how the xenomorphs came to be, and while his prequel was greatly anticipated by the fanbase, the response was a mixed bag. Though Prometheus is a flawless technical marvel, it ultimately collapses under the weight of its own convoluted narrative and lofty thematic aspirations. Prometheus perhaps poses too many questions to its audience, interesting though those questions may be, but ultimately is unable to answer any of them in an effort to sell the future movies. Scott gave himself the gargantuan task of delivering a satisfying conclusion to this behemoth of a story. But was he able to overcome this great challenge and succeed in delivering a brilliant origin series for one of cinema's greatest villains? We'll explore that soon enough. But for now, let's just say that I'd much rather see a director shoot for the moon than not, because while he may never reach that intended destination, he'll still wind up drifting amongst the stars. Somewhere not so far from where I'm sitting right now, in the late 21st century, Doctors Elizabeth Shaw and Charlie Holloway have led their team on a scientific excavation. They make a discovery in a small cave which is crucial to their research, in the form of engravings which appear to direct whoever discovers them towards a distant constellation. Believing these markings to be thousands of years old, the pair wonder if these directions could lead them to uncovering the mystery of how mankind came to be created. Funded and backed fully by the Wayland Corporation, it's good to see you again, the two embark on a journey across the stars to meet their makers, henceforth to be referred to as the Engineers, which is the name given to them by Shaw. The crew on the Prometheus, comprising experts in various fields, blindly agree to this mission due to a persuasive financial offer. Whilst in hypersleep waiting to reach the mystery constellation, the crew are watched over and cared for by David, an android with an unlimited and unimpeded consciousness, who we watch as he enjoys his routine of taking care of basic maintenance, one-upping clone Ripley, and absorbing our human history and culture. He also gets to know his crewmates a little better by intruding on their dreams and memories while they sleep. Arriving at their destination after a 2-year voyage, the team prepares to land on the planet LV-223, where, after being briefed on the mission's objective for the first time, a small ground team departs to a nearby structure, in which they come across a large space ominously dominated by a grand statue of an engineer's head. This looks onto a number of cylindrical canisters, containing an organic liquid which we later learn can infect and adapt to whichever organic matter it comes into contact with. Finding a decapitated engineer corpse with a suspicious hole in its chest nearby, the crew realise that they may be in some peril, and so return to their ship to study the decapitated head. Unbeknownst to them, David brings with him a canister of the strange substance. Fascinated by it and pressed forward by an insatiable curiosity, David exposes the Prometheus to the liquid and watches the horrors that ensue from afar in an effort to entertain Wayland's ulterior motive. Surprise, surprise. From the engineer's head, Shaw discovers that it possesses human DNA, but in the end, the Prometheus and her crew realise that it may not be in their best interest to come into contact with their creators after all. There are perhaps two key things that Prometheus is most fondly remembered for. The stunning visuals and world design is one, but first I'd like to talk about the interesting characters accented by phenomenal lead performances across the board. Dr. Elizabeth Shaw is our lead character here, and is the lone surviving human by the end of the movie. She's a young, bright archaeologist who is also deeply religious. She inherited her faith from her father, who passed away unfortunately when she was a child. To honour him, she wears his crucifix at all times. She desperately wishes to uncover the answer to the creation of human life, and believes that the carvings her team finds in Scotland are an invitation that will lead her to these answers. Her determination to find these answers is demonstrated by her decision to rush out into the storm, risking her life in order to retrieve the decapitated head of the engineer that the crew found in the caves on LV-223. When Shaw discovers that the engineers and humans have similar DNA, she is of course delighted, but doesn't intend to stop there. But after her lover, Dr. Holloway, is infected by the black liquid, she can only watch on helplessly as his body is destroyed from within by what she comes to believe is a biological weapon created by the engineers to be unleashed on Earth, wiping out all of mankind. Her mission's objective shifts to one of survival, and when she succeeds in stopping the liquid from being taken to Earth by the lone surviving engineer, she and David set off to find out why the creators had such a disdain for the human race in the end. Shaw is a strong protagonist modelled after the great Ripley that came before her. She possesses a great deal of conviction, but is also compassionate. She also shares Ripley's maternal desires. In fact, it seems that her own laments towards her infertility is what drives her to succeed in discovering how life came to be, to find out why she herself is not worthy of creating life. But while the nods to Ripley are interesting to observe, she is in the end a weaker character than her predecessor. She left me rather frustrated due to her character's conflicting philosophical positions. She rarely feels like a scientist in that she irresponsibly follows a faith-based hunch with little evidence supporting it, dragging the Prometheus crew across space and into grave peril due to her nonsensical belief that the message in the Scottish cave is an invitation. David is the android on board the Prometheus. He isn't just any android, however, he's the first android created by Weyland himself. He's an extremely interesting prototype of the androids that we come to know and love in the franchise, with the thing that sets him apart being his freedom to exercise free will as a result of a lack of a master or governing body to answer to. Instead, David sees his creator, Weyland, as a father figure in this movie, and he is partly motivated by a desire to take care of and if possible cure his dying father. But more interesting in my opinion is his character's desire to prove his viability and perhaps even superiority as a sentient life form, as opposed to his human crewmates who look down on him as nothing more than a mere synthetic and view him as lesser. And you can completely sympathise with David in this goal, given that we see how crushed he is to be told by Holloway that he was merely created by humans because they could, and that his life has no real significance. This makes his decision to infect Holloway's drink with the black liquid appear to be symbolic of that old chestnut of the dangers of the development of artificial intelligence and how they will inevitably rise to overthrow their creators and enslave them, yada yada yada. David is perhaps the most interesting character in the movie, and so it makes sense that his character would go on to be the focal point of the next movie. Plus, Michael Fassbender is phenomenal in the role, but we'll come to that shortly. Dr. Charlie Holloway is a brilliant young archaeologist just like his partner Elizabeth Shaw. His motivations differ from hers, however, in that he does not share her faith, making his character's willingness to travel across space to follow a random cave drawing even more ludicrous than his partner's. He wishes to have a conversation with his creators, so while Shaw revels in the discovery that humans share DNA with the engineers, seemingly confirming the origins of our creation, Holloway couldn't care less, and instead is depressed by the fact that all of the engineers appear to be dead, so he can't have that face-to-face with them. It seems a bit strange to me that a scientist would be so disheartened by such a monumental discovery regarding human creation, especially an archaeologist. Holloway is also quite an unpleasant person, and his interactions with David cause the audience to feel somewhat ambivalent about his eventual demise to the black goo, which is a shame in my opinion, as the impact could have been greater were he less of a dick, so we actually cared for him. Thankfully we do care enough about Shaw, so the fact that she can only witness his death and is powerless to help is where much of the emotional drive is drawn from. Those are perhaps the three main characters of the film, with the rest of the crew being of secondary importance, and so I'll move on to the great performances now and discuss some of the supporting players there. The standout has to be Michael Fassbender as David. Fassbender has said that he based much of his performance on Sean Young's character in another of Ridley Scott's films, The Great Blade Runner, as he looked to emulate her character's subtle vacancy of a soul despite a longing to possess one. I have no idea how you would actualize that. I guess that's why I'm not a world-renowned actor myself, but Fassbender does, and it completely works. David carries himself with a great deal of innate purposefulness to his movements. There's something that you develop as an actor which is to propel yourself with a sense of focus, always directing your energy to the location ahead of you that you intend to inhabit. They call it a neutral posture, and I suppose it's the idea of moving with as little human input or flaw as is possible, and Fassbender has clearly mastered this form of movement. It's the form you adopt before you add colours to your movement, creating the character that you will eventually adopt. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the first scene on the Prometheus, where we see David act out his daily routine. The way that David cycles, the way he walks, even the way he eats, it's all remarkably flawless and vacant of expression, just as Fassbender highlights in The Replicants in Blade Runner. He performs human actions in the least human way possible, giving us that uncanny valley effect, and it's just wonderfully unsettling. His expressions throughout are similarly disturbing, whether he's being hassled by Vickers and not flinching a muscle in his face, or if he's being spoken down to by Dr. Holloway and the only indication of his displeasure is the sheer bitterness present behind his eyes. It's a crime that Fassbender received no recognition for this role in awards season. I could wax lyrical about his contributions to the movie for this whole video, but as this is a star-studded cast, I'd rather not spend so much time on one performance when there are so many other great ones to be observed as well. Idris Elba and Charlize Theron are both great as the captain of the Prometheus and the daughter of Weyland respectively. Neither of them are blessed with a great amount of screen time, but they both leave a positive mark on the viewing experience, and the carnal relationship that they develop is both believable and clever in how it comes about. Theron was directed to perform with a similarly vacant disposition as David, so as to prolong the mystery as to whether she is an android or not. But when it's revealed that she is in fact the daughter of Peter Weyland, her regimented and uptight character suddenly makes perfect sense. Her character does everything she can to remain in control of a situation that is spiralling away from her. You can imagine that she spent her whole life attempting to gain the approval of her father, and so it's entirely understandable that she would hold as much contempt for David as she does, given that Weyland views him with more pride than he ever has his own daughter. It's actually quite a sad and tragic story when you think about it. As Shaw, Noomi Rapace gives a spirited performance throughout, even though she has to struggle against her character's confused motivations. Her visible heartbreak as Holloway dismisses the miracle of creation, despite knowing that she herself is incapable of what he deems to be a menial task, is really hard-hitting, and her performance during the cesarean scene later in the movie is a standout moment in no small part due to her contributions to the scene. I believe entirely that she can feel the painful expansion and the jerking of the trilobite in her body, and it leaves me just gripped to the moment and praying that she can get the thing out in time. She's a compelling character that you root for, and it's a great achievement on Ridley Scott's part that he was able to invoke a similar audience reaction to Shaw's character to the reaction given towards Ripley all those years ago. But not all of the performances are brilliant. There are some that leave a bit to be desired. Sean Harris as Fifield is a buffoon of a character whose incompetence is at times unbelievable. I don't begrudge Harris for this performance, because it's the writing team that seemed to fall asleep when working on his scenes. This is a character who's a geologist and is the crew's navigational expert, and yet despite being in full control of the crew's technology needed to navigate the structure in LV-223, he somehow finds himself getting lost. Fifield is also the moaner of the group, and he clearly is the most in over his head amongst the group. He seems to be the one that is the least ashamed to admit that the mission is purely financially driven for him, whilst the others seem to have at least some sort of interest in the voyage, which is founded upon their passion for their field. His partner in the crew's comedy duo is Milburn, played by Rafe Spall, who is given even less to do than Harris. I don't really have too much to say about his performance. He's fine in the film, but his character perhaps commits the greatest sin in this story by treating the strange vagina worm like a stray cat in his neighbourhood. I myself am convinced that the sheer stupidity of this character's decision-making in this moment exists purely to provide a jump scare for the entertainment of some of the younger viewers in the theatre. But it really drags the immersion of the viewing experience down when you're just cringing at how nonsensical it is to try to pet a cobra-like alien creature which is taking a predatory interest in you. I hope that if there's one thing you noticed during my plot synopsis earlier, it's that this movie is simply breathtaking from a visual standpoint. Scott's return to the franchise meant that this was all but guaranteed. Every shot is so detailed and visually engaging in a way that only a movie with him at the helm could. I particularly enjoy the picturesque images on the planet LV-223, which were created through use of NASA technology as well as aerial photography from both Iceland and Jordan, which would be enhanced and modified in post-production. MPC in the UK teamed up with other major VFX houses, Wetter Digital and RSP, and these houses were responsible for over 1,300 digital effects to be included in the movie. These stunning visuals are a representation of just how far technology has progressed in cinema, in that this film is almost 10 years old, but its visuals are about as flawless as we've ever been able to achieve since, and they look devoid of any technological input at all due to how seamlessly they've been implemented. Needless to say, the massive budget that was pumped into Prometheus allowed Ridley Scott's cinematic vision to be fully realised, and this aspect of the movie is enough to make it worthy of the price of admission in my opinion. For some, this was even enough to force their hand to purchase tickets to 3D screenings of the film, though I can't speak to the quality of the 3D experience as I never got to see it myself. As for some of the more complex interior shots, Fuel VFX were responsible for most of the hologram effects in the movie, with the most notable of these perhaps being the orrery on the alien ship, when David discovers a living space jockey, as well as a detailed holographic map, sort of like a futuristic planetarium. This scene famously required up to 100 million polygons to create, and was certainly not cheap to render. A fantastic article on the artofvfx.com website details Fuel VFX's contributions to the film, and this article makes for a fascinating read that I would highly recommend should you be interested. The link to this article will be in the description below. As I said, Scott has always been highly thought of due to his elaborate and detailed world design, and Prometheus is yet again a home run in this department. The environments feel lived in and treacherous, just as they did in the original Alien film, but now there's no need for the intense fog or the neat camera tricks to help convince the audience of the grand scale of these locations, as the resources available allowed the massive sets to be fully realised this time round. The new creatures in the movie are intriguing and appropriately horrifying to witness, with my personal favourite being the trilobite, an octopus-like creature miraculously conceived by the infertile Elizabeth after she and her partner Holloway have sex on the ship. This happens after David spikes Holloway's drink with the black goo from the metal cylinder that he snuck on board the Prometheus, which infects Holloway and begins to transform his body into this twisted mutation. Elizabeth is surely bound to suffer the same fate as the corpse that she and her team found earlier, but her quick thinking and Ripley-like pragmatism lead to her using the ship's medical facilities to perform an improvised caesarean operation in what is probably the most tense scene in the whole film. Crippled by fear and her wound still fresh and only partially sealed, Shaw leaves the creature in the medical bay and rushes off to warn her crewmates. By the time she returns to the ship later on, the trilobite has rapidly grown to a huge size capable of restraining and consuming the space jockey as it hunts the Doctor. All of these chaotic events are enhanced by the sweeping orchestral score of Mark Streitenfeld, whose contributions to the franchise are effectively atmospheric, even if they are somewhat uninspired or unmemorable. Streitenfeld does harken back to Goldsmith's wandering sense of exploration, going as far as to incorporate the first movie's theme into his own score on one occasion, but he's never able to recapture the magic of that original piece himself, which makes the classic reference a bittersweet one. So far, I've been extremely complimentary to Prometheus as an artistic project. Full stop. I have nothing to add to this. I think that Prometheus is the most jaw-droppingly impressive movie in the franchise. It has the greatest sets, the most stunning visuals and visual effects, the best performances, perhaps not the greatest score, but the general sound design and the editing are all pretty much stellar. It's what you would expect given that it was released in the 2010s with modern technology and limitless resources. But if there's one thing that all the technology and money in the world can't hide or make up for, it's a shoddy script. There is a lot to unpack in this movie from a thematic standpoint. Prometheus bites off way more than it can realistically chew in its 2-hour runtime, and this absolutely shows. It's a movie that tries to say so much, but it winds up saying very little at all, and this is what's so infuriating for viewers and critics alike, who dubbed the movie's story and heavy use of symbolism pretentious and convoluted to the point of being indecipherable. So let's take a look. We'll start with the title, which is symbolic in itself. Ridley Scott crams so much into the story, including a clumsy exploration of the meaning of life itself and humanity's place in the universe, and he tries to weave some aspects of Greek mythology in here, namely of course the story of Prometheus himself, but this is done quite poorly and the connections between the stories are few and far between. Man is created, yes. Man inches closer and closer to rubbing shoulders with the gods, yes, and then pays the price for doing so. But that's effectively where the links end, unless you consider the gift of fire in the original story being replaced in this case by technology, which is what Scott suggested in an interview during the film's press tour. But this just raises more questions for me. Who gifted the fire to us? Are the engineers who left the directions to LV-223 in the Scottish cave responsible? Was it even the engineers who left those markings there in the first place? Perhaps the plan was to tie all this together in future films, so we'll see how this is handled in Alien Covenant. Scott returns to some of the themes that were tackled so successfully in his first outing. First of all, there's the exploration of corporate greed, which has been a focal point throughout the series, and how it impacts the working and lower classes. And as it did before, this theme again directly ties to the exploration of the humanity, or lack thereof, found in synthetic life forms, and how those beings can exercise the wishes of the wealthy at the expense of the poor. Although in this film, there's a twist to that idea in that David acts out of choice rather than out of obligation as Ash did. Scott clearly enjoyed the inclusion of religion in Alien 3, and so implements some of that here in Prometheus. Scott, being a self-proclaimed atheist, does consider the relationship between man and their creators to be of particular intrigue, which we can deduce based on the amount of times that this dynamic has been explored in his works. In Prometheus, Scott and Lindelof ask the question of where is God, and why has he yet to return to visit his creation? The narrative is often that one must believe in science or religion, and that the two cannot work with one another. But, on the contrary, Scott tries to show us here that science could perhaps be the key to allowing us to unravel our faith and receive the answers to such lofty questions. Though, as we soon learn, it may be our own curiosity and drive to advance as a species that leads to our own extinction. Perhaps it's better to live in a world of blissful ignorance than it is to pursue knowledge of the divine. Perhaps our makers are waiting for the moment that we advance to pose a threat to them, and that is when they will tear us down to be rebuilt from the ground up. Though this was an extremely ambitious thing for Prometheus to attempt to tackle, I do have to concede that it does feel pretentious at times. Feminist ideas are present once again in Prometheus as they were in Alien. As we see, Shaw is shattered by the belief that she is not worthy of creating life due to her infertility. A comment is made on the lack of value that society places on women who are incapable of bearing children. Why does this perceived disability bring Shaw such shame, and should it? It's an interesting question, but in a twisted and perverse turn of events, Shaw does become impregnated by the alien liquid, ironically cursed by motherhood, just as Ripley was in Alien 3. As Shaw attempts to rid herself of the fetus, she faces several barriers, the first of which is David, an oppressive force which tells her that she should not be so hysterical, before sedating her and limiting her bodily agency. When she wakes and she's able to sneak into the medical bay, the machinery is not prepared to operate on the female body, and so there is no option to safely extract the alien, meaning that Shaw must risk her own life by improvising an operation herself. There are clear parallels with our own reality to be found in this scenario. Women who resort to unsafe practices in order to free themselves of an unwanted pregnancy in a world where the means of doing so safely are available but withheld from them. My biggest issues with Prometheus rest almost solely on the shoulders of the writing team. Their propensity to introduce so many complex ideas, but then ultimately leave them unaddressed, as some weak attempt at sequel baiting, is infuriating to no end. Prometheus may be a mess, but it is undoubtedly a beautiful mess, and I think it's paced fairly well too, holding my interest for its full duration despite covering some exhaustively convoluted subject matter. Like I said at the beginning of this segment, I'd much rather be served something overly ambitious which misses its mark than something overly safe which takes no risks, so I consider Prometheus to be a worthwhile watch all in all. But Ridley Scott was listening to the mixed responses to the film very closely. It wasn't very scary, people said. I thought it was an Alien prequel, people said. Well, just as Shaw realizes, sometimes you should be careful what you wish for. And so, we arrive at the final movie of the Alien franchise. At least, that is the case at the time of this video's release. I do hope that you've enjoyed this 2-hour examination of the series so far. If you have, please consider liking the video and sticking around here by hitting the subscribe button to see future uploads from myself. I'd be eternally grateful. I wanted to thank you and channel all of my optimism now rather than at the end of this video, because we're about to dive into something that might require all of my remaining goodwill to discuss. Alien Covenant is loud, uninteresting, it's predictable, and perhaps most crucially and unforgivably, it's boring. I started looking back at the series with a great fondness because this universe is one of my favourites by quite some distance, but as I progressed through my marathon of it, I felt a kind of despair which grew as I came closer and closer to revisiting Alien Covenant. I hadn't seen it since its release, and had little faith that it would be any better than I remembered it being back in 2017. Well, unfortunately, I have to say it was actually worse than I remembered. Nothing in this movie is original. It plucks details and plot points from all of its predecessors and makes a kind of mockery of them, delivering a package designed to appeal to the jump scare loving crowds that dominate the horror market today. That would be fine in itself, but it also contradicts its own pre-established lore and honestly worsens the impact of the brilliant work that came before it. And I have to say, I do have to hold Ridley Scott accountable for this. Prometheus had a fairly tragic script, yes, but Ridley Scott took it and spun a beautiful web around it, one that was engaging and dared to ask some tough questions of its viewers, without treating them like children. The script to Alien Covenant is equally as atrocious, if not worse, but it feels like Ridley Scott cowered to the outcry of those same thrill-seeking cinema-goers and offered no resistance to the bland and generic story that his writers came up with. He abandons everything that made Prometheus so intriguing, including its philosophical dialogue and its interesting religious themes, and instead he serves as a ghost train amusement park ride which sequentially and predictably stops to deliver cheap and bastardized versions of the best scary moments that the franchise has produced. And all this to support the reveal of how the xenomorph came to be, which is utterly underwhelming and honestly damaging to the legacy of the monster as a whole. It feels as if this movie was one that Scott felt obligated to create, as opposed to one that he felt truly passionate about. And I think, similarly to The Rise of Skywalker a couple of years back, this movie is the product of the movie market today, which relies heavily upon fan opinion and reaction due to videos like this one that you're watching. If enough people share a sentiment and produce their own rant videos on YouTube, or reviews on IMDb, Rotten Tomatoes, or even personal blogs, then we live in an age now where fan opinion is so easily accessible, and the word of audience dissatisfaction will maybe reach filmmakers, but will definitely reach the studios who view this art form strictly as a business. And so, when we left Shaw and David as they flew out to find the engineers' homeworld to find out why they planned to destroy Earth with the black liquid, you could be forgiven if you expected that that would be where this sequel starts off, or if you thought that that would be what Covenant looks to answer. But instead, either due to studio meddling or direct audience pressure, Ridley Scott chose to fast forward 10 years and abandon that interesting cliffhanger, giving us a shoehorned explanation as to why Elizabeth and the whole engineer world inhabitants died off screen between these movies, so we can have more of what everybody loved in Prometheus.
Now there are two of them.
So, 10 years after the events of Prometheus, which saw Dr. Elizabeth Shaw escape the planet LV-223 with the help of the untrustworthy android David, the Covenant ship is travelling towards Origai 6, where the onboard crew intends to deliver 2,000 dormant colonists so that a new human colony can be erected there. On the way, a wave of solar energy deals some significant damage to the ship, and so the crew awakens from cryosleep prematurely to repair the damage. While making those repairs, they pick up a transmission from a nearby uncharted planet, which is human in origin, and so they choose to land on the planet to stretch their legs and investigate the source of the signal. Whilst on the planet's surface, some members of the crew are almost immediately infected by spores released by nearby fauna. I guess that's what happens when you just give yourself to a foreign atmosphere without checking for pathogens or without wearing any PPE just in case. As the crew explore the environment, they come across the crashed Prometheus ship with no sign of Shaw's body to be seen. As the infected crew begin to convulse and show signs of mutation, they are rushed back to the shuttle to be medically examined. But before any treatment can be administered, unarmoured versions of the xenomorphs emerge from their hosts and tear through the Covenant crew, with the escape shuttle being destroyed during all of the chaos. Facing certain death, they are rescued by David, and must lay low with him during the ongoing storms until the Covenant mothership can enter the atmosphere to collect them. David, being the snaky individual that he is, begins to hatch a plot to take control of the Covenant ship and expose the onboard colonists to his own creation, the xenomorph facehuggers, which he just happened to grow in his basement with the remaining black goo left over from when he unleashed it onto the engineer's planet. Yeah, I don't know, it's a mess. The xenomorph is back, and the origins they're given cheapen the events of the franchise as a whole, as their encounter with humanity and Alien no longer appears to be purely coincidental and, interesting. No longer does Alien appear to be an exploration into the dangerous unknown, but instead it feels like a series of events which were almost destined to happen. As it turns out, humanity has always been directly tied to the creation of the perfect organism. There were so many possibilities and so many life forms out there in the stars to choose from, and so the reveal that it was created by our own means feels a little bit unimaginative and reductive. But people, myself included, I might add, were clamouring for that extra xenomorph lore, so I guess this will be a reminder to us that we should be careful what we wish for. The characters in Alien Covenant are not human beings. They're all just as uninteresting as their android inventions. And the lack of time spent with the crew in the early scenes of the movie is most likely why it feels this way. There is footage out there, and promotional material, which shows the Covenant crew interacting with each other, laughing and talking with one another, and it's a real shame that this stuff didn't make it into the movie. As is, we have no reason to care about Jacob's demise, and there is little emotional impact when the crew start to be picked off one by one. Each of the crew seems to be married to another in their ranks, but there are so many faces to get to know that it's easy to forget who is married to who exactly, and as a result, when a member of the crew is killed off, I struggle to really give a shit, and I can't empathise with their spouse's heartbreak beyond the level of, oh, I think those two were together? No, wait, maybe it was those two. Honestly, the way that the writers try to tell us who is married to who is so on the nose that my eyes rolled into the back of my skull.
Hey, language, be respectful there, sugar dick.
I can hear you.
She started.
Riggs can talk about your tits if he wants. I'm very secure in our relationship.
Behave yourself with my wife.
You got it.
The truth is that these guys were never intended to be fleshed out and developed characters. No, instead they exist solely to be target practice for the CGI alien to rip apart later. I guess that's fine, it's just disappointing that we had some great and really interesting characters that we came to know in Prometheus, and then here the best characters once again were the two in Prometheus. And one of those two has 2 seconds of screen time, she's not even alive. And yet she still manages to be more interesting as a decayed corpse than Upworth or Rix ever managed to be. The main character of Alien Covenant, other than David, is Daniels, proof that Ridley Scott is quite fond of the female action hero with short hair. Catherine Waterston gives an excellent performance in the role, and it's not her fault that the character purely exists as a pair of eyes to show us the scary horror scenes. She zips around like a superhero in the final act of the movie, and the stunts that her character performs are really impressive and enjoyable. Her character was married to Jacob, played by James Franco. Played by in very large inverted commas. After he dies, she becomes second in command on the Covenant, but exists to carry her underprepared and overwhelmed superior on her back. Walter is the trusty android that every ship needs. He handles the maintenance, while the crew are in cryosleep, and is excellently played by the thespian Michael Fassbender. Walter sports a hardened and, from what I've heard, terrible Southern American accent, unlike David's soft British one, and the scenes between the two androids are absolutely the best parts of this movie. Walter is a newer model than David, and was built with the hindsight that David's ability to dream and create ultimately proved to be a danger, and so Walter has had this freedom of thought removed, much to the disapproval of his elder. I think it says a lot that the greatest moments in this film are the ones with only Michael Fassbender on the screen. Long made fun of is the scene in which the two admire each other's fingering. But I'm actually a great fan of this moment, where we see David try to prove to Walter that it's better to live as a ruler in hell rather than a servant in heaven, and that Walter is capable of being his own master and creating symphonies just as David can. David is back and is more overtly sinister than ever in this movie, which makes sense given that 10 years have passed, allowing his grand delusions that he is superior to his creators to really marinate and grow. The reveal that David killed Shaw and experimented on her body with the black liquid is a horrific one, and the decision to not show this and to instead leave it up to her imagination is one which I applaud. Poor Shaw has gone through so much over the course of these two films that her fate contributes to the depressingly tragic and nihilistic feeling of this film as a whole, which I think rivals, or if not beats out, Alien 3. The opening scene of the movie, in which the theme of creation is re-established with the conversation between Wayland and David, is a solid one. The set is beautiful and tastefully minimalistic, perhaps illustrating emptiness and the lack of joy that radiates from Wayland as a human being. There are hints of Wayland's abusive treatment of David, which once again reinforces how much it must have sucked for Vickers to grow up as a human child, who can actually experience pain unlike David. However, I was disappointed to see that Scott did choose to show the relationship as a master and slave power dynamic, more so than a father and son one, because I believe that the latter makes David's choices in Prometheus much more compelling, as it suggests that they were founded upon love and loyalty more than anything else. As for the supporting characters in this movie, there's Tennessee, like Dallas.
Are you serious?
Tennessee probably comes closest to forcing a bit of emotional reaction from me when he learns about his wife's death. But then 20 minutes later he's smiling and laughing with Daniels as if nothing even happened, and he never even tries to get to the bottom of how his wife dies, he just accepts it. So that's a script issue more so than it's a Danny McBride issue. On the contrary, his performance is actually very likeable, and he was the only supporting character that I could even recall before I rewatched Covenant for this video, so that's got to be a positive in my book. Billy Crudup plays the ship's captain, Christopher. He assumes the role following the abrupt death of Jacob, and is not the most convincing of leaders. He freezes under pressure and is hesitant to make the fast and succinct calls that are necessary at times. His insecurities as a leader therefore cause him to be dismissive of the crewmates' advice, which we see when he shuts down Daniel's very correct assertion that they should not be visiting the alien planet, that they know absolutely nothing about, and that they should instead remain on their intended course. He follows David's directions to let himself be made a facehugger host like an absolute chump, despite seeing how untrustworthy David is mere minutes before. I'm going to say that this is a character flaw due to his weak mentality, rather than a writing flaw on this occasion. There are plenty of times where the characters make really dumb and unbelievable decisions in this movie, but this isn't one of them, I think, so congrats. Kareen and Maggie are a very frustrating duo, for the reasons that I just spoke of. To be honest, Kareen's probably fine, it's just Maggie. She locks Kareen in the medical room with the infected Ledward. This is without a doubt in my mind the most effective horror moment in the movie. The practical effects are on point and gruesome, and Benjamin Rigby's possessed movements are enough to cause nightmares by themselves. But this situation could have been avoided if Maggie had allowed Kareen to leave quarantine. I understand why quarantine is necessary, given the fact that she'd made contact with Ledward's blood, which may be contaminated, but Maggie herself literally just had his blood splattered across her forehead, so you'd think that Kareen would point out that she too should be in quarantine. I don't know, but it's a frustrating moment nonetheless, which reduces the impact and immersion for me just a little bit, which is otherwise an extremely effective scare. The visuals in this movie, they're once again brilliant. For me, they're less imaginative than what we received in Prometheus. The shot of the engineer's ship floating above the onlooking engineers before they're mercilessly executed by David is a great image that I imagine would have once again looked wonderful if given the 3D treatment. The environments for me are less varied than in Prometheus, so even though they are of a similar visual quality and level of detail, they were less memorable to me, which was a shame. I like the set design of David's hideout. I enjoy all of the props that are placed around his tables and the walls and the artwork on his desk, which I wouldn't be surprised to learn were actually real paintings made by Giger that were then used in this movie. That would be cool. The eggs look really good, especially the interior, which looks great as it always has. I wouldn't be surprised again if Ridley Scott actually used the exact same sheep intestine with cow liver combo to make this. I don't know how the eggs came to be in David's back room. I guess we know where Ridley Scott stands on the chicken versus the egg argument. And the updated facehuggers were really effective with their unpredictable animated movements, as they finally look like something that isn't just a puppet or a cheap prop, as it's being hurled across the room. They look alive. Something I'm less of a fan of is the design of the xenomorph. Or maybe it's less so an issue I have with the design itself, and more how it's utilised in the movie. It clings to walls and moves in a far more animalistic fashion than it has before. But gone is the charm of the clever framing used in the original, gone are the invasive camera angles and the extreme close-ups on the vile creature before it strikes, and instead we see the thing prancing around in broad daylight, and standing proudly with Scott making no attempts whatsoever to hide its full frame, and thus removing a lot of the tension in my mind. As I've said before many times on this channel, I'm a firm believer that less is more, and the power of the imagination is what makes horror so effective in the first place, but there's no room for that here. In fairness to Scott, we've seen this thing so many times now, there was probably little fear factor left to lean on, and so it seems that he's stopped trying to make the creature frightening in a creative way, and has instead just tried to draw upon its unpredictable movement patterns to try and overwhelm our senses. Every action the alien makes is so fast and lethal, whereas the technological limits in the 70s meant that he was forced to make a more methodical movement pattern when crafting the kills. I'm old school, I like the guy in the suit myself, but that's just me. The score for the film was pleasantly strong, I thought. There were a lot of callbacks to the 1979 Alien movie, and of course the main theme of Prometheus returns whenever Shaw is brought up. But something doesn't become good just because there's something you recognise in it. To be honest, that sentence pretty much sums up my whole review of this film. The problem for me was that so much of the score was drowned out by the noise going on screen, so I had to sit down after watching the film and listen to some of the tracks in an isolated context, and I enjoyed a lot of what Jed Kurtzel, sorry if I butchered that name, was putting down. It's not touching the scores of the original quadrilogy in my mind, but I do think it's a bit more interesting than the score of Prometheus. I'm a particular fan of Spores, which is a really ominous track just loaded with suspense, gradually building from some light percussive sounds into this earth-shattering brass-heavy piece, and it just gave me goosebumps. Chestburster is also another highlight track, which is kind of ethereal and divine, perhaps trying to show the xenomorphs as being these godly creatures which are worshipped by David. It's one of the few tracks in there that isn't crammed with dissonant harmony, and makes for a refreshingly easy listening experience given what the rest of the soundtrack is like. I think if I were to place my finger on the exact moment where Alien Covenant loses me, it's probably when Walter and David start to have their shaky cam fist fight. From there on we have the schlocky shenanigans of the protomorph running after the Covenant crew, and my brain just about shuts off when the CGI creature is crawling around the ship's exterior as it's taking off. Then the entire last 25 minutes is just pure fan service, and not really the good kind. I don't know why this scene was included. There's genuinely no reason I can think of other than to be used for trailers so that people can see fit naked people having shower sex and then rush to buy their tickets. I guess it's a less subtle version of Lambert's death scene, where the sexual undertones were muted but still suggested, whereas here they beat you over the head with them. The quality of the scene wasn't helped by the fact that I genuinely had no idea who these two characters even were, 90 minutes into the film. But from here on out, the alien is sprinting through the corridors, and it's also mindless and tensionless. You know exactly how this alien's going to be dealt with as well. It just goes out the airlock like the rest of them. Anyway, so once the 30-minute exercise in making money is over with, Tennessee and Daniels are the sole survivors along with Walter, who won his fistfight with David and snuck onto the ship as it was about to take off. I want to be careful here because this could be considered a terribly executed twist that was supposed to shock us, or perhaps it was supposed to be obvious, so then there would be some dramatic irony in that we know David is on board while Elizabeth and Tennessee don't. I'm going to go with the latter because I have to give a great deal of credit to the writers in that the reveal of the twist, or of the penny drop moment, is very well done. Just as Tennessee is already fast asleep in his cryo chamber, Daniels is about to follow suit. As she's locked into her tube and she's saying goodbye to her friend Walter, she references a conversation that the two of them shared earlier about Walter helping her to build a log cabin by the lake in their new colony. With her chamber completely sealed, the dread on her face when she notices that David can't recall the conversation is terrifying, because she's so powerless to do anything. So David's plan is revealed to have been a success in the end, as he now has full control of the ship and regurgitates facehugger embryos and places them alongside the human colonists ones on board. It's a decent final scene. You can only imagine what David is going to do with all those human lives available for experimentation. I also would wager that Daniels and Tennessee will never wake up again, as they will be used for this exact purpose, just as Shaw was. But it was no secret that a third Ridley Scott directed prequel film was supposed to be on the way, but the negative response to Alien Covenant by fans and critics alike meant that the project was shelved and has remained nothing more than an idea to this day. But you know, I don't even think a sequel could work anyway. I think that this prequel series has been so brutally botched at this point that a reset or a time jump has to take place. It would be sad to see Michael Fassbender leave his role, but androids can stick around for a few hundred years or be replicated, so I'm sure we could maybe see him again at some point. But seriously, has this series explained in an adequate manner how the xenomorphs came to be as it claimed it would? I don't think it has. Covenant and Ridley Scott himself have suggested that it was David who created the xenomorph. But as there was a mural to the creature on LV-223 in Prometheus, I find this impossible. Perhaps he simply discovered how to create the xenomorph, but he certainly wasn't their creator, even if he erroneously believes himself to be. And then Ridley Scott contradicts himself yet again if you take a closer look at the original Alien film, in which the space jockey discovered on the ship wreckage on LV-426 is thought to be hundreds of years old. And thus the eggs on the ship and the facehugger which presumably killed him, or her, simply must predate the events of Prometheus and Covenant by quite some way. So, in the end, Prometheus and Covenant promised an explanation to something that nobody even asked for, but took us on a wild goose chase with no answers of substance provided at all by the end of it. Honestly, it's clear that these prequels were just being planned as fast as Fox could ship them out, and this final film just turned out to be a complete disaster in terms of continuity. Come to think of it, what was up with the neomorph at the end of Prometheus? Was that going to be explained at some point in the series? I think this is all I have to say about Covenant, because I just see it as a massive waste of potential. And for that, I have to place a lot of blame onto Ridley Scott. I hope you can now understand what I meant earlier when I said that this feels like an obligation to him as opposed to a passion project, and that's really sad to see. It's like the writers treated the screenplay like a piece of overdue schoolwork, and scribbled something together in one night and just prayed that the teachers wouldn't notice. Thankfully for them, he didn't. Either that, or he never understood what made his masterpiece so special in the first place. I love this franchise, despite how it may seem with my critique of Alien Covenant. I'm so harsh on this film because I see how much potential this universe has, and I was left bitterly disappointed with the result of this prequel series, after Prometheus tried to bring something fresh to the table, but ended up leaving the series as an absolute illogical shambles. The franchise has been on a steady decline since the first two films, that much is clear and commonly accepted. What interests me so much about Alien and its universe conceptually is that the premise is so malleable. It can work in a variety of genres, as we've seen, so long as it's directed and written competently. The first two films are so unique and brilliant, and they hold their reputations for good reason. Every subsequent film tries to copy or emulate at least something from one of them, and tries to recapture the lightning which was caught in a bottle all those years ago. In fairness, Prometheus tried to do something very different, which is admirable, but as we know it didn't work out as well as we'd hoped. But it saddens me that Scott was then deterred by the reception of that movie, that he then reverted back to type with Covenant. My only hope moving forward is that Alien 5 or Alien Covenant 2, whatever it's going to be called, my only hope is that it tries to bring something new to the table again, like Prometheus attempted. Just be sure to hire some elite top draw writers this time around, and then I'm all but certain that the alien universe will prove that it still has some life in it. And maybe stop trying to explain the origins of this thing. How about just be grateful that it exists, and move on to tell new stories with it? Again, I'd like to thank you so much for watching this video. It hasn't been easy to make, but it's been a lot of fun. Oh, and for anyone wondering, here's my personal ranking of the films, starting from my least favourite. But wait, there's one piece of Alien canon that I still want to talk about. One piece that I'd imagine many who have watched this video haven't actually had a chance to experience themselves. Stay tuned, as there's still one more video to come.